Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Gareth Thomas.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sir, before I list my engagements for the day, I'm sure the whole House would want to join with me in expressing our deep condolences to the Spanish people and the families of those who died in the terrorist attack in Madrid last Thursday. It underlines the threat we all continue to face from terrorism in many countries and why we must work together internationally to safeguard our people against such attacks and defeat terrorism in all its forms and wherever it rears its head. This morning I'm meeting some ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I will have further such meetings later today.
Gareth Thomas.
I'm sure the whole House would wish to be associated with the Prime Minister's remarks in relation to the Madrid bombings. Can I ask the Prime Minister what steps the government is taking to combat the continuing threat of terrorism?
We have to take every measure we can in terms of security. We have to be vigilant as people, and we have to realise that this began. There were terrorist attacks before September the 11th. But it began in earnest with the attack on America on September the 11th, 2001. And when people talk about the most recent attacks being retaliation, they should recognise that September the 11th happened was an entirely unprovoked attack on the people of the United States of America. And the truth is, these fanatics will stop at nothing in pursuit of a fanatical cause based on a perversion of the true faith of Islam. And the only two alternatives we have is to confront it or be defeated by it. And I believe the vast majority of people in this country, and indeed throughout the free world, want to confront terrorism and to defeat it.
Yeah. Michael Howard.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I join the Prime Minister in expressing the sympathy of everyone on these benches with the Spanish people, with those who were injured, and with the families of those who lost their lives in last week's appalling atrocity in Madrid. And indeed, I endorse the sentiments which the Prime Minister has just expressed. Don't these events reinforce some very harsh truths? That Europe is not immune from attack by Al-Qaeda, and that, as we know from the chilling statements that organisation has made, there are no concessions that will stop these attacks. Shouldn't everyone now recognise that there is no such thing as an opt-out from the war on terror?
I agree with that entirely, obviously. And it's just worth pointing out that amongst the countries that have been hit by this form of terrorism, they include Kenya, Tanzania, Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Jordan, Tunisia, Pakistan, and Morocco, as well as Spain. And the fact is that there is no way of appeasing these people. They have no cause that any negotiation can take place upon. They have made it absolutely clear, as they did in that chilling statement they put out a few days ago, where they said, "You love life, we love death." Unfortunately, that is the nature of the people we are dealing with, and that is why we have to defeat them.
The Polish Prime Minister has rightly warned that revising our positions on Iraq after terrorist attacks would be to admit that terrorists are stronger and that they're right. Does the Prime Minister share that view?
I do share that view, and I thank the Polish people and the Polish Prime Minister for the steadfast position that he has taken in the war against terrorism. And can I just point this out as well? It is worth actually reading, and I can put a copy of this in the Library of the House of Commons, the statement that was put out by the Abu Hafs al-Maziri brigades of Al-Qaeda last Thursday, because that statement is a statement which indicates that the war that they are engaged upon, Al-Qaeda, is not simply in respect of the issue to do with Iraq. They also mention Afghanistan, but they also mention Palestine and Kashmir. But they also go on to say how it is right to kill innocent Jewish people in whatever country they happen to be, apparently for no other reason than that they are Jewish people. They then go on to cite campaigns in Yemen and Pakistan. In other words, the idea that if we were to give in over the issue of Iraq, that would be an end of the matter so far as they are concerned, is completely and hopelessly naive. The fact is, these people will continue. It is a war. It is a war on our way of life. It is a war on our democracy. It is a war on our freedom. And that is why we must redouble our efforts and defeat it. And the best way to do that is for the whole of the international community to stand firm on it.
Tom Clark.
Mr. Speaker, is my right honourable friend aware that a large number of Kurds were killed or kept in detention after a football match in Syria last Friday? Now, since the Kurds have very little confidence in the government of Syria in seeking to defend them, what steps would my right honourable friend take to restore human rights for those Kurds in Syria as elsewhere?
I hope we will continue to put pressure on Syria to treat all people of whatever ethnic background or religious background, to treat them fairly. But I actually think the very best thing that we can do is to have a state next door to Syria, namely Iraq, in which Kurdish people, Sunnis and Shias, all live and work together in peace in a stable, prosperous and democratic country. And I have to say, there was some surprise at the poll yesterday that indicated that a majority of people in Iraq were optimistic about the future. I have to say, the only thing that surprised me is that people were surprised. I mean, Iraq has swapped government by a brutal, psychopathic, murderous dictator for the possibility now of Kurds and other people in Iraq living together in stability and peace. And if that happens in Iraq, then that is the best possible omen for the rest of the world.
Campbell.
On behalf of my honourable and right honourable friends, may I associate myself with the expressions of sympathy and condolence which have already been made. Does the Prime Minister agree that, irrespective of our attitudes towards military action against Iraq, we now have a continuing moral responsibility to the people of that country, in particular with regard to security and to reconstruction? Does he believe that a greater role for the United Nations will help us to implement that responsibility? And what progress is being made in New York in order to find a fresh United Nations Security Council resolution?
Well, I do agree, first of all, that it's important that we stay in Iraq and that our troops stay in Iraq working with the Iraqi people. And I thank him for the support of his party for that position, despite our differences over the war. Secondly, yes, we all agree there should be a greater role for the United Nations, and that's why we are working hard with the United Nations, with the Special Representative, Mr. Brahimi, in order to ensure that we get a proper and orderly handover of power to the Iraqi people. Because in the end, the other thing that poll indicated yesterday is that the vast majority of Iraqi people want Iraq to be run by Iraqis. That is our position as well.
Sir Mingus Campbell.
Might I ask the Prime Minister to turn his attention to Afghanistan, in substantial parts of which Al-Qaeda now appear to have been re-established? How can we best carry on the campaign against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and at the same time maintain our commitment to the people of Iraq? Will he ensure that Her Majesty's government provides sufficient financial resources for our armed forces to meet these obligations?
We will do that, but the best way of defeating it, and we are looking at it in the context of NATO now, as to how we ensure that in those parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban aren't strong, and that is actually the vast majority of the country, that we have sufficient reconstruction teams, as they're called, working with the military of several nations in order to restore order there. And that has obviously been very successful around Kabul, but also in other places in Afghanistan. Then down in the southeast of the country, where the main problem is with the Taliban, it's important we free up as many of the American troops at present elsewhere in Afghanistan in order to fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda there. But I think the other point I would make to the right honourable gentleman is that these are all parts of the same struggle. I mean, when people ask us, for example, why are we in Iraq, that is a perfectly legitimate question and I can answer it. But there is another question people should ask themselves, and that is, why are Al-Qaeda trying to get into Iraq at the present time? Why are they trying to get into Afghanistan again? And that is because they know that if we manage to lift these once failed states into a state of prosperity and stability, that is a hammer blow to their fanaticism.
Keith Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the light of the government's welcome announcement of a substantial increase in the funding of science research and the Department of Health's recognition of the Wolfson Molecular Imaging Centre at Christie Cancer Hospital in my constituency as a world-leading clinical research facility, will the Prime Minister consider the merits of allocating some of this extra money to this pioneering centre for cancer treatment, since currently only a very small proportion of its budget is allocated from central government funds?
The issue of medical research is obviously extremely important. I think my right honourable friend may have something more to say about that in a moment. But and can I pay tribute to the Wolfson Molecular Imaging Centre, which is on the site of Christie Hospital in my right honourable friend's constituency. It performs a very important research task, and I think it is important that two things happen. First of all, that we continue with the additional investment in cancer services in the National Health Service. There's been an over £500 million investment in that in the past few years, which is making a big difference to the treatment of cancer patients, and cancer deaths have actually fallen by 10% in this country over the last few years, alongside 20% fall or more for cardiac deaths. But we also need to invest in the research for the technology and the cures of the future, and I'm sure that people will have heard with interest what my right honourable friend has said.
Michael Hurd.
Will the Prime Minister rule out further tax rises if his party wins the next election?
We will continue to run the economy in a stable way and generate money for investment in our public services, and whatever pledges we make on tax will be in our manifesto. And the pledges we have made so far on the basic and top rates of tax have, of course, been kept.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister can't give a straight answer to a straight question. There was a time. There was a time when he was very free with his promises, even if they turned out to be utterly worthless. In 1995, the Prime Minister said that his party had no plans to increase tax at all. Since then, we've had taxes on marriages and on mortgages, taxes on petrol and on pensions, taxes on small business and on large business, taxes on those who buy a house and on those who go on holiday, and council tax up 70%. So to take just one of his tax rises, will the Prime Minister promise not to put up national insurance again, his tax on jobs and pay, if he wins the next election?
We certainly did put out national insurance, and that was to increase the investment in the National Health Service, and he voted against it, and therefore voted against the investment in the National Health Service. When we're talking about tax promises, I'm surprised he's got the nerve to come to that dispatch box. Doesn't he remember promising not to put VAT on fuel? Doesn't he remember promising not to double VAT? Doesn't he remember the tax rises under the Conservative Party all through the period of time that he was sitting in government? Yes, this party put up national insurance to fund our National Health Service, but we've managed to run the economy with lower mortgages, lower inflation, lower unemployment than the Conservatives, and we've increased investment in public services. When did the Conservatives ever do that?
Let me remind the Prime Minister about some rather more recent events, Mr. Speaker. Before the last election, he said people shouldn't suppose he would raise national insurance, but he did exactly that in the very first budget afterwards. So in return for these taxes, does he agree with one of his own ministers who said last month, too often, a lot of money has been spent, but very little seems to have been achieved?
I'll tell them exactly what has been achieved. We just heard some figures in this House about what's been achieved. For investment in the health service, we've not just got new hospital buildings, the biggest ever hospital building programme since 1948. We've also got 50,000 extra nurses, 14,000 extra doctors, cancer deaths down 10%, cardiac deaths down over 20%, extra operations, extra outpatient appointments, lower waiting lists, lower waiting times. That's what the extra money has bought us, and he's voted against every penny of it.
Well, it's not what his energy minister says, Mr. Speaker. A man who was a rising star in his government, at least until today, because his energy minister said, in a year or so, he said, we're going to have an election in the UK. He's clearly well informed, Mr. Speaker. When people will say, we've paid a lot of taxes, but what has really been achieved with that money? Spot on, I'd say. People will indeed say that, Mr. Speaker, at the time of the next election, And if they know that's what ministers think too, then why on earth should anyone disagree?
I said what the money in health had bought. Let's look at the money on education. I'm absolutely delighted we're having this argument. Go into any school in this country, a primary school, results are up and up by over 50% compared with what was happening when he was in office. Look at the school results on GCSEs, on A-levels. Go into the schools and see the new buildings, see the new computers. Go and see how many extra police officers there are in this country today. And all of it is in stark contrast to when he was in government. When he was the Home Secretary, he cut police numbers. When he was Employment Secretary, unemployment went up. When he was Minister for Local Government, he introduced a poll tax. And when his whole shower were in power, we had higher inflation, higher interest rates and higher unemployment. So let us continue this argument between now and election day.
Martin Linton.
And while we're on the subject of education, will the Prime Minister find time in his schedule to write to the leader of Wandsworth Council to ask him why he has gone back on his promise to passport this year's school budget increase in full and is withholding more than £500,000 intended for Wandsworth school children? Yet is supporting his party's plans for a pupil's passport which could take between £1 and £2 billion out of school budgets.
Can I say, Mr. Speaker, we certainly will not be adopting that policy, though I have to say to the House, if you study the policy statements that have come out of the Shadow Chancellor, the Shadow Education Secretary and the Chairman of the Conservative Party, it's quite hard to work out what that policy is. But as far as I can make it out, it is for a pupil passport that would allow people to go out of the system and take that money to private schools.
Oh, he said no. He said no.
He says no, all right. But here is what... Where is the brains of the Tory party? I can't remember what shadow position he's got, but here's what the brains of the Tory party said on the Politics show. I'm talking about using the pupil passport as a contribution to higher fees already being charged by private schools. So I can tell my honourable friend that if I could only work out what their position was, I would attack it. But in any event... Let us be quite clear, the best way to get education not for a few but for many and standards up is to carry on with the programme of investment and reform under this government.
Can I drag the Prime Minister back to reality and invite him to bang a few heads together in the Department of Health, who are threatening one of his major projects in my constituency, Job Centre Plus, something I welcome? Is he aware that arbitrary and retrospective funding changes made by the Department of Health... Is he aware that arbitrary...
Order. Allow the honourable gentleman to speak. Mr. Love.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware that arbitrary and retrospective changes to the funding rules by the Department of Health are threatening 8 major health projects in Worcestershire, one of which is a one-stop shop in Droitwich that brought together Job Centre Plus, a major new health centre, the police, the district council, the county council, the Citizens Advice Bureau and other voluntary groups. But his government is now threatening the creation of precisely the kind of joined-up government it claims to support.
Well, I will certainly look into the project that the honourable gentleman is talking about, but surely he should recognise that surely what he's calling for is even more money in the National Health Service. Now, I can see... No, he's just calling for more money in his own constituency, but not in anyone else's. Well, I think the intelligent thing, surely, I'll look into the point that he makes, but the intelligent thing, surely, is to recognise that this investment in the National Health Service is yielding results, and that is why it is so unfortunate that the party opposite manages to cut it.
Andy Reid.
As it's National Science Week this week, has the Prime Minister had time to reflect on the neglect of our science, research and development technology base over the last 50 years? Is he aware that companies like Intelligent Energy in my constituency, which have grown out of the university, are excellent examples of what can be achieved? They're world leaders in fuel tech technology and developing their products for the developing world, having things in South Africa already. However, will he ensure that any increase in spending is evenly spread around the country so that institutions like Loughborough University, which have a track record in innovation and delivery and collaboration with business, get their fair share rather than it being concentrated in the hands of a small few universities, to ensure that the growth that we've seen in our local economy continues and is a model that will be replicated across the whole of the UK?
I mean, I understand that the DTI is actually providing over £3 million to Intelligent Energy to assist in the development of fuel cell technology at Loughborough University. But the point that my honourable friend makes is absolutely right. The UK is actually one of the best places in the world for biosciences. It's important that we carry on with the huge investment in science that we're making, and that's why it's so unfortunate, again, that the party opposite has pledged to freeze and therefore cut in real terms the spending on science. I think spending an investment on science is one of the surest ways to entrench the economic stability we have for the future.
Edward Garney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister now regret sacking Lord Irvine last summer?
I tell you what I don't regret. I don't regret at all that we are proceeding with the proposals to make sure that the person who is in charge of our court system is actually sat in the department running the courts, delivering a better court system for the people of this country. And it is actually only the present incumbent who is the first holder of that office actually to have his office in the building where the courts are administered from, and that's why it is the right thing to do.
Ronnie Campbell.
Hi, Ronnie. Whilst it was good to see the minimum wage being increased this week, does the Prime Minister agree with me that anything under £5 an hour in this day and age is peanuts? But I will give the Prime Minister one thing. It was his government introduced the minimum wage. If it was left up with the Tories, and left up with the wishy-washy Liberals, we wouldn't have had an agreement.
Well, I think that's as close as I'm going to get from an unqualified statement of support from my honourable friend, and frankly I welcome it. But it is not merely that we have now extended this to 16 and 17-year-olds. It is from October 2004. The adult rate will increase to £4.85, and that is going to help 1.8 million low-paid people in this country. That is a huge bonus for some of the poorest families in this country, and alongside the Working Families Tax Credit and the Children's Tax Credit, it indicates how much we're doing to help hard-working families get into work, stay there and make work pay.
Simon Thomas.
I have a letter here from a 10-year-old constituent who lives on a sheep farm in Tregaron. And he says, I would like to run the farm someday when I'm older, and I'd like to ask, is there a future for me in farming? Does he have a future in farming?
Yeah. Of course there is a future. Of course there is a future in farming. What I think is important, however, is that we recognise that our farming industry, like other farming industries in Europe and around the world, will undergo very great change. It's why when Sir Don Curry headed up our commission that looked into the future of farming, he came out with recommendations that I think will put farming on a more sustainable basis for the future. But I think if he grows up and talks to those people who are in farming now, they recognise that change has to happen, but they want the government there working with them to make the change happen in a proper way, and that's what we're doing.
Ross Cranston.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on publishing the alcohol strategy on Monday, which set out in hard evidence the social and economic costs of binge drinking in this country. But can my right honourable friend confirm that unless some parts of the industry smarten up their act in relation to advertising and promotion, which actually contribute to this culture, further government regulation is inevitable?
I think it is important that we work in partnership with the industry to encourage responsible drinking. And my right honourable friend is entirely right in what he says there. I think the other point that is important too is to recognise that as a result of the legislation passed in this House, the police now have considerable powers both to shut down pubs or clubs where there is disorder routinely happening, as a result of excessive drinking, and also, of course, they've got the full range of measures, including the fixed penalty notices, to deal with drunken disorderly behaviour. So I think we need two things. We need a more responsible attitude on the part of the industry, but we also need to make full use of the police powers now introduced.
Julian Brazier.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that this party has solidly supported him in the war against international terrorism. Could I urge him, however, to read the report of the Defence Select Committee, chaired by one of his right honourable colleagues? And could I ask him if he's really happy that when we face this threat, we have the smallest regular army for more than a century, the smallest reserves for several centuries, and our logistic capability has been so emasculated that we can't even get chemical protection, body armour, and in some cases even ammunition to the front line.
We will respond, of course, fully to the Defence Select Committee report. I think it's important not to exaggerate the situation. The fact is our armed troops have performed magnificently in extremely difficult circumstances, not just in Iraq but in other arenas in the world, and are a huge credit to this country. And as for defence spending overall, quite contrary to reports that are in some of the papers, we are actually increasing defence spending in real terms as a government. I've no doubt at all we will continue to make a big commitment to defence, and I hope, since he says it's important, and I think he's right to have a cross-party consensus on these issues, that he will change the position of his own front bench, which is to freeze defence spending in real terms, which would mean a cash cut in the amount of money going to defence.
Mr. Speaker, talking about education, can I thank my right honourable friend for coming to my constituency last week and opening the King's Academy, which is a great testament to this government and its contribution to education. Will he join me to congratulate David Vardy and his team who put this project together with the local authority, with our government, to build this great monument in my constituency? Can I ask him further what support this government is going to give to ensure that this academy excels, as like everything else in education, excelling on this side of our government?
First of all, can I thank my honourable friend for welcoming me to his constituency. The King's Academy is a remarkable achievement by Mr. Vardy and his team. These city academies are just being opened now. There is a whole programme to roll them out across the country. And what is important about them is that they are providing state education to some of the poorest and most disadvantaged communities in this country. And there is nothing more inspiring, frankly, particularly when one knew the old school that it replaced in my honourable friend's constituency, to see the brand new buildings, the teachers and staff with total commitment, and the pupils there eager to learn. And it is one of the best examples of modern social justice I can think of.
Gerald Gillen.
Mr. Speaker, just down the road from Chequers, Chesham Hospital, the Misbourne ward at Amersham Hospital, and the intensive care baby unit at Wickham Hospital are all threatened with closure, and the acute trust and the mental health trusts have huge deficits. Yet the government spends 18% less on healthcare than the national average on every man, woman and child in Buckinghamshire. Can the Prime Minister tell me why the people of Buckinghamshire are worth 18% less?
I mean, I will look into the precise figures that the Honourable Lady uses, but according to the figures I have, actually there's been somewhere in the region of over £117 million of funding for Chiltern and South Bucks Primary Care Trust for the last year. And I entirely understand why she would like even more money going into her primary care and secondary care services, even more money. But the fact is that it is important to recognise we are making a huge additional investment into the National Health Service. And I hope people realise there is now a very, very clear choice, made even more manifest by what the Leader of the Opposition did earlier today, and that is that we are in favour, even if she wants even more money, we are in favour of the money we're putting in, carrying on, going to the National Health Service, delivering real results for the people of this country, and the party opposite, whatever they may like to say, are opposed to that investment. And that is the difference between a party committed to maintaining and reforming and changing and renewing the National Health Service and one committed to getting rid of it.
Mark Lazarovich.
My right honourable friend will be aware that some of the poorest countries in the world, particularly Ethiopia and Niger, are currently being denied additional debt relief effectively by the US, the German and the Japanese governments, even though these countries are entitled to that debt relief under the agreements from the G8 countries. I'm sure my right honourable friend will agree that the world community fails to live up to its promises in these areas, it will make it more difficult to tackle issues on other areas, such as the threats of world terrorism. So will my right honourable friend speak to leaders of those countries and urge them to stop blocking this debt relief?
We will do all we can, and my right honourable friend, obviously the Chancellor, has been leading initiatives in this area to make sure that we get debt relief for the poorest and most highly indebted countries. And I can assure my honourable friend we will use every means we possibly can of maintaining not just a leadership position for this country, but trying to relieve the debt burden on some of the poorest people and poorest countries anywhere in the world.
Order, order. Chairman of Ways and Means.
Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be for the convenience of honourable members if I remind them that at the end of the Chancellor's speech, copies of the budget resolutions will be available to honourable members in the vote office. Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the purpose of this budget is to lock in for Great Britain the economic stability that can and will endure. And it's a sign of the stability that Britain has already achieved, and a tribute to the dynamism and hard work of the British people, that even after the creation of 1.8 million jobs since 1997, 1.3 million of them in the private sector, over 100,000 extra businesses, today and every working day in our country, 600 new businesses are starting up, 25,000 men and women each and every day are finding new jobs, and an additional 10,000 new vacancies are each day being advertised, with new jobs being created at 3 times the rate of the 70s, 80s and early 90s. Now, for decades after 1945, Britain repeatedly relapsed into recession, moving from boom to bust. But I can report to the House that since 1997, Britain has sustained growth, not just through one economic cycle, but through 2 economic cycles, without suffering the old British disease of stop-go. And overall growth since 2000 has in Britain been twice that of the euro area and higher even than that of the United States. Indeed, in the pre-budget report, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I told the House that Britain was enjoying the longest period of sustained economic growth for more than 100 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have to apologise to the House. Having asked the Treasury to investigate in greater historical detail, I can now report that Britain is enjoying its longest period of sustained economic growth for more than 200 years. It is the longest period of sustained growth since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And with Britain not only more stable, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but better off than 7 years ago, it is time for us, facing new global economic challenges, to combine a new British confidence about our economic potential with a new resolve to make the right long-term decisions and reforms to achieve excellence in education, science and enterprise, challenges which no industrial nation can ignore, where other nations are moving forward and in which I want Britain to lead. Now, our advantages as an island nation are our global reach, which is wider than almost every other country. It is a historical achievement a historical record of scientific achievement that is longer than almost any other country. And we have a foundation of political and now economic stability that goes deeper than almost any other country. And this budget's judgment is that to be a world economic leader in this new global era, we must now make the necessary investments in our science, in education and in enterprise. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, last year we forecast growth for 2003 of between 2 and 2.5%. When I made that forecast a year ago, the Leader of the Opposition said it was not just incautious and wrong, but I quote, a deliberate misrepresentation of Britain's economic prospects, and said not to meet it destroyed credibility. I can report to the country that our growth in 2003 has indeed met our forecast, and the British economy grew in 2003 by 2.3%. And it is because of Bank of England independence, new fiscal rules, our symmetrical inflation target, the sanctions of the New Deal, the reduction of national debt. It is because Britain had the strength to take these long-term decisions that over the last 4 years, while economic growth in Germany has averaged less than 1%, Japan 1.4%, Italy 1.4%, France 1.8%, the euro area 1.6%, the United States 2.4%, growth here in Britain in these years has averaged 2.5%. And it is growth combined with consistently the lowest inflation for 30 years, the lowest interest rates for 40 years, and the highest levels of employment in our history. Now, in the past, Britain has been first in, worst hit, and last out of world recessions. But in recent years, in contrast to the two previous world downturns, in both the early 80s and the early 90s, employment, which fell by 1.3 million in the early 80s, 1.5 million it fell in the early 90s downturn. This time it has not fallen but risen. And as today's employment figures confirm, claimant count unemployment is just 2.9%. It is the lowest since November 1973, and Britain is closer to full employment today than for a generation. Yeah. Inflation, which rose to 20% in the early 80s and to almost 10% in the downturn of the early 90s, has this time averaged just 2.4%. Interest rates, which peaked at 16% in the 80s and at 15% in the 19s downturn, interest rates are today 4%. And mortgage rates, which rose to around 15% in both the early 80s and early 90s, are 5% today, and they are still the lowest for 40 years. And now, having come through this world downturn, and as trade strengthens, rising this year by 7.75% according to our forecasts, the challenge for British industry is to make the most of the new opportunities of the world upturn. We expect domestic demand to go by 3.5% this year and 3.25% next year, as consumer spending moderates and growth becomes more balanced. And our belief is that British manufacturing and service industries will rise to the challenge. Fixed investment, which has fallen around the world, is expected to grow in Britain by more than 5% this year and more than 6% next year. Business investment is expected to grow by just under 4% this year and 6% in 2005. Manufacturing output, which was most affected by the global slowdown, has now grown in 4 successive quarters and is now expected to grow in Britain by just under 2% this year and over 2% next year, and imports and exports are both expected to grow by more than 5% this year. So overall, I can report a British economy strengthening throughout 2004, and while always vigilant to the risks, growth in 2004 is expected to be 1.7% in France, Germany and the euro area, around 2.8% in Japan, but between 3 and 3.5% this year in Britain, with of the G7 countries, Britain and America again growing the fastest. And I can confirm that under our new inflation target, inflation is expected to be just 1.75% this year and 2% next year and the year after. Our long-term stability and strength depends on avoiding the two great economic mistakes of the past. So there must be no weakening of anti-inflation discipline, and there must be no neglect of investment in our wealth-creating base. And based on sound fundamentals, monetary and fiscal discipline, and making the right decisions at the right time in the cycle to invest in education, science and our enterprise, Mr. Deputy Speaker, based on these sound fundamentals, I would forecast growth in Britain in 2005 to be 3 to 3.5%, and in 2006 to be 2.5 to 3% as the economy returns to trend. Looking forward, while vigilant to the global economic cycle, the challenge is to strengthen the British model for stability. And our objective must be to lock in that stability, not just for a year or two or for an economic cycle, but for a generation. So a year ago, I initiated a series of studies to examine how we can tackle potential inflationary pressures in housing, potential bottlenecks and deficiencies in the supply side of our economy, how we can deal with potential fiscal pressures from ageing, healthcare and the costs of unemployment, and what are the most appropriate fiscal rules for the long term. Last week, Professor David Miles reported and recommended a more transparent and competitive market in mortgage finance, a set of recommendations that will now be considered by us and the Financial Services Authority. The report by Ms. Kate Barker today concludes that the supply of new homes consistently lags behind demand, and that the number of houses built in Britain, which are currently 175,000 a year, must rise substantially if we are to reduce house price inflation and increase the number of affordable homes for people wishing to buy and rent. Now, the Government today accepts the Barker recommendations for the new British Real Estate Investment Trust that would improve the supply of rented property. for the release of more public sector land, for in each region one body responsible for housing and planning, and in principle for extending the contaminated land tax credit in brownfield areas. The Deputy Prime Minister will now consult on how we can increase the supply and affordability of housing, what goals should be set while striking the right balance between the economic and social case for development and environmental and social needs. While the business rate sets a tax on developed properties, Mrs Barker's report states that there is none on the unearned increment in land values when undeveloped land is granted planning permission. And because this is a long-term issue for both the future of housing and for stability, the way forward is not only to consult widely on this proposal, but to see whether a long-term consensus can be agreed. So I hope that over the next year, all parties will study this Barker proposal, and it must be in the interest of the whole country to see whether we can forge a shared approach that would safeguard our environment, lead to more affordable housing, and at the same time keep interest rates as low as possible and contribute to the greater stability of Britain. Last year, we identified the housing market, housing finance, and other inflexibilities in capital, product and labour markets as major barriers to meeting 2 of our 5 tests for Euro membership. Today, we are publishing, alongside the budget, a detailed report on flexibilities in Britain and Europe, and I can inform the House today that while the Government does not propose a Euro assessment be initiated at the time of this budget, the Treasury will again review progress at budget time next year and report to the House. Fiscal discipline is and must be at the heart of our strategy for long-term stability. While vigilant on personal debt, we have studied the 3 main sources of fiscal pressure in the advanced industrial economies: the costs of unemployment, pension costs in Europe, with state pensions costing by 2050 up to 15% of national income, and the rising costs of public sector subsidy for private health care, as in the United States of America. And we have concluded that it is prudent for Britain to take further steps to move the unemployed from welfare to work and reduce the costs of unemployment. And we are right also to maintain a rising level of pension credit rather than link pensions to earnings, and we are right to avoid uncapped public sector liabilities from subsidies to private health care. I have also studied proposals for alternative approaches to the fiscal framework, and I'm today publishing a paper comparing our British framework with the rules of the European Union Stability and Growth Pact and examining the principles based on our experience which should guide the evolution of fiscal policy in the future. Now, the conclusions of our study are that first, the flexibility to take the right monetary and fiscal decisions at the right time to sustain stability and growth requires countries to take tough decisions to achieve low levels of long-term national debt. The second principle identified by our study is that based on low levels of public debt, fiscal policy can and must take account of the economic cycle, supporting monetary policy by allowing borrowing to rise when the economy grows below trend and reducing borrowing when the economy is above trend. And the third principle identified by our study is it makes sound economic sense for low-debt countries like ours to borrow for investment. Rigidly balancing the budget year on year means that fiscal policy could not support money. Rigidly balancing the budget year on year means that fiscal policy could not support monetary policy over the cycle, and even in low-debt countries, the debt-to-GDP ratio would fall year on year, even when it is obvious that more investment is important to the long-term strength of the economy. And our fiscal rules to keep the debt-to-GDP ratio low and stable while balancing the current budget over the economic cycle allow us to borrow for investment every year of the cycle, and these rules have been tested and have succeeded at every stage of the last 2 economic cycles. So it was in the national interest, firstly, to follow rules on debt and to cut debt in the late 1990s. It was in the national interest to enable fiscal policy during the recent world downturn to support monetary policy. And now and in the future, it is in the national interest, on the basis of low public debt, to borrow for investment to strengthen our economic fundamentals. So, So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will not neglect the need for long-term investment in our country, and I will not impose a balanced budget rule which would cut spending regardless of the debt level or the economic cycle. Such a policy, whether imposed by a future government or by a rigid interpretation of the European Stability and Growth Pact, would in fact be an exact replica of the mistakes of Britain's stop-go past and would put at risk Britain's stability and growth. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome the support for our monetary policy framework that I have received of late from opposition parties, but the experience of the past few years is that stability requires support for both pillars of our British macroeconomic framework, monetary and fiscal policy working together. So let me set out today's detailed fiscal figures. Our projections are based on assumptions audited by the National Audit Office, which include, for public finance purposes, trend growth at 2.5% rather than 2.75%, and do not take full account of the expected gains to the public finances from lower unemployment, compliance and VAT receipts. But after all the decisions announced today, our current budget figures for 2003-04 and for the years to 2008-09 are in billions -21.3, falling to -11, -5, 0, then rising to +4 and +9. Our first fiscal rule is that over the cycle we balance the current budget. Having accumulated surpluses at the start of the economic cycle, we meet our fiscal rule, the golden rule. Indeed, we have an average annual surplus over the whole cycle, an overall margin or surplus of £11 billion. I've also tested the golden rule against not just our cautious assumptions, but a more cautious case. And again, the current budget moves back to balance by the end of the forecast period. The average current budget for the first 4 years of the next cycle is not just in balance, but in surplus. So having met our rule in this cycle, we are also on track to meet it in the next. Our second rule is our sustainable investment rule, demonstrating our ability to borrow for investment. I can report that debt this year is just 33% of national income. Our rule is that debt should be kept below 40% of national income, and in future years it will be 34, 35, 36, 36 and 36%. Compared with debt of 44% in 1997 when we came to power. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we meet our second rule over the cycle in every year and by a margin in excess of £50 billion. I turn therefore to net borrowing, compared with 8% 10 years ago and an average of 6% net borrowing over the early 1990s. Net borrowing this year and in future years to 2008-09 is as a percentage of GDP 3.4, 2.8, 2.5, 2.1, then 1.9 and 1.6% of GDP, with for this and for future years the cash figures 37.5 billion, 33, then 31, 27, 27 falling to 23. And net borrowing adjusted for the economic cycle is just 2.4% this year, and in future years 2.1, 2.3, 2.1, 1.9 and 1.6% of GDP. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a decade ago, after the end of the last world recession, the British deficit was the equivalent of £90 billion, around 2.5 times higher than it is today. And in fact, our deficit is now lower than all our major competitors of the industrialised world. As a percentage of GDP, the deficit in 2004 is nearly 4% in Germany and France, 6% in Japan, 5% in America, but the comparable British figure is just 2.8%. Net debt is now 45% of national income in France. In America, it's 50%. In Germany, it's 55%. In Japan, it's risen to 86%. In Italy, it's actually 94%. But this year in Britain, it is just 34%. So with our deficits lower than our competitors, lower than in past decades, with our debt lower than our competitors and lower than past decades, we meet both our fiscal rules. And it's because of this that I am now able in this budget at one and the same time to afford all our existing commitments including our ongoing and additional commitments in Iraq, Afghanistan and in the fight of terrorism, amounting in total to £6 billion, to be able to set aside as a prudent margin £1 billion next year and £2 billion in future years as a reserve for annually managed expenditure, and to have, in addition, the flexibility and freedom in this year's budget and in the coming spending review to release extra resources for the nation's priorities. Unemployment, Mr Deputy Speaker, is now costing us £3 billion a year less than 1997. Debt interest payments are costing us £7 billion less than 1997. It is a total of £10 billion less this year, part of the dividend from difficult decisions we made in 1997. And stability and growth themselves have yielded even greater gains, and they give us a clear budget choice as to whether to cut taxes, invest more, or cut borrowing. So I'm able in this budget, with a strengthening economy and the strong and sustained monetary and fiscal position, to set out the government's choice on how to allocate these extra resources. And I have had a number of budget representations about priorities for tax and spending. The debate we now have about the nation's priorities and about the choices we make will help determine the economic strength of Britain and the fairness of our country far into the future. And I hope the whole House could agree that, given Britain's position today and the challenges ahead, the priorities for our country are first not to endanger but to entrench the stability and growth we have achieved. Second, not to imperil but in supporting our armed forces, police and security services to ensure and enhance our national security. And thirdly, I believe the whole House would also want to ensure that all our citizens are fully prepared to meet the challenges of a global economy, and to ensure also that the coming generation start from a position not of weakness but of strength. As we make our judgments for the budget and spending review, one option, having secured in recent years the gain from cutting unemployment and cutting debt and from stability and sustained growth, one option would be to cut borrowing or taxes. But on borrowing, as I have told the House, both debt and deficits are lower than our major competitors, much lower than in the past, and well within our fiscal rules. And on tax, while I have raised national insurance to pay for the National Health Service, I have cut long-term capital gains tax for business assets from 40p to 10p. I introduced a 10p starting rate for income tax, and in previous budgets since 1997, cut the basic rate of income tax, corporation tax and small business tax. So let me now set out the budget's decisions on tax. I've examined rates of corporation tax and capital gains tax, and I have no need to raise them, so I propose to freeze rates. On air passenger duty, on insurance premium tax, on vehicle excise duties for cars and lorries, I propose to freeze rates. On the climate change levy, I will freeze rates and at the same time extend the numbers of businesses who can benefit from 80% discounts. On the aggregates levy, I will freeze rates and in Northern Ireland extend the reliefs to cover all aggregates. On betting duties, I will freeze rates and I will review the tax treatment of betting exchanges and their clients. On stamp duty, I will freeze stamp duty. On inheritance tax, I will not only freeze rates, but I will exempt more estates from inheritance tax, raising the starting point of tax to £263,000. 95% of estates will pay no inheritance tax at all. Mr Deputy Speaker, for this budget's other tax decisions, my priorities are the needs of enterprise, of ensuring fairness to families and pensioners, and the environment. My priority for enterprise at this stage of the economic cycle is to encourage rising levels of investment. Venture capital is the seedbed of future enterprise, and so for the next 2 years, venture capital trusts will secure tax relief for investments at a higher level, now up to £200,000 a year, and not at the lower rate of tax 20p, but at the higher rate of 40p. From 1st April, firms with turnover under £58,000 will not have to register for VAT, and that is the most generous VAT threshold in Europe. From April the 1st, an additional 13,000 businesses will benefit from simplified VAT accounting. From next year in 2000 enterprise areas, we will further increase the tax incentives available for firms to invest. The Government is determined to achieve our goal of balanced economic growth to the benefit of every region and every nation of the United Kingdom. So today the government is accepting and will implement the Lyons Review for the relocation of civil service jobs. We will relocate out of Whitehall a total of 20,000 public sector jobs, creating new employment opportunities in the regions and nations of the United Kingdom. And today, to further assist regions and local communities, I can announce the full details of the new local authority incentive under which local authorities who help create more local businesses will share the additional business rate income. For local councils in all parts of the country, I am able to allocate for the next 3 years a total of £1 billion extra, money available for local services. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the last 7 years, we've raised over £1 billion. We've raised over £4 billion a year through the sale of surplus assets and land. And for the years until 2006, we now expect the sale of surplus assets to raise over £5 billion a year for new investment. We will also be selling off the last of the remaining government shareholdings in the utilities. When we announced deregulatory measures in December, I said we would be working with business to identify further reforms both in Britain and in Europe. The Secretary for Industry is announcing she will devolve the business-linked services to the regions. We will review the burden of inspection and the overlap between enforcement regimes. Sector by sector, we will tackle unnecessary regulation, starting with chemical, construction and retail industries, and having accepted the case for the Inland Revenue to pay the working tax credit directly to employees, we will consult now with employers on detailed implementation. And we have submitted today to the European Union our detailed proposals for tackling regulation in the European Union. I would like to do even more to encourage new and growing businesses to invest and expand. I can only do so if we close a loophole under which some have, without changing their economic activity, used our zero tax rate for small business, not to invest and grow, but simply to avoid tax and national insurance by reclassifying their income as dividends. There are those who have proposed that to tackle this avoidance, we should abolish the zero and reduce rates altogether. Instead, I propose to retain the zero rate and also the reduced rates for retained profit, and indeed do more for investment. But I will close the loophole by taxing distributive profits at 19%, bringing the tax on distributed profits for those small companies into line with other companies. And to do more for investment, I will increase initially for 1 year investment allowances for the smallest businesses from 40% to 50%. So overall, a small company making pre-tax profits of £25,000, investing £10,000 in plant and machinery, which paid over £5,000 in tax in 1997, will pay £2,375 in tax, almost £3,000 less, as we maintain and improve the incentives for small company investment. Since 1997, support for the British film industry has been worth £2 billion, and the numbers of films that have been made here in Britain have doubled in that time. I now propose to transfer the available reliefs for British-made films with budgets below £15 million from the third parties, a minority of whom have abused these reliefs, and to pay reliefs directly to the filmmakers themselves. And the new relief will be set at a new and higher level of 20%. It has been put to me that we should now introduce a general anti-avoidance rule. I do not at this stage intend to introduce this, but I will today close loopholes in partnerships, finance leasing and VAT, and I will make it a requirement, as in the United States of America, that accountancy firms and those promoting these schemes register them with the tax authorities, the Inland Revenue. I turn now to the environment. I'm pleased to report that as a result of the incentive announced last year, the fuel industry is ready from September the 1st this year to move to the more environmentally friendly sulphur fuel. This fuel will be available throughout the country by September, so I will delay for the second year running the annual rise in fuel duty for nearly 6 months. And while the duty rise for low sulphur fuel will be 1.9 pence per litre, the duty rise for the new and soon-to-be standard sulphur-free fuel will be from September the 1st just 1.4 pence, in line with inflation. I will also raise red diesel, fuel oil and liquid petroleum class by 2.4 pence a litre. Duty for fuel oil will still be just 6.24 pence a litre, duty for red diesel 6.64, and duty for liquid petroleum gas 7.82 pence a litre. To encourage cleaner fuels, I will give the same incentives to buy ethanol from January the 1st next year as I'm extending to biodiesel, until at least 2007, a 20 pence per litre reduction in duty compared to petrol and diesel. And for the same environmental reasons I set out last year, I will go ahead with the changes that have already been announced in landfill duty. In energy-efficient technologies will also be available now for enhanced capital allowances. From next Monday, I will implement the normal annual inflation rise of 1 pence on a pint of beer, 4 pence on a bottle of wine, but I will freeze duties on cider and sparkling wine. And for small breweries, I will not only continue the successful tax relief scheme, but extend it further and double the volume of beer production that is eligible for relief. I announced in the pre-budget report that owing to continuing high levels of spirits fraud, owing to the high level of spirits duty fraud, we would legislate to implement the ROC's report recommendations to stamp spirit bottles unless a workable alternative could be found. In making my decision today that stamps are necessary to tackle fraud, I will help the trade with cash flow costs, and I will defer payment for tax stamps, and I will assist firms with their capital investment. I've also decided for the 7th budget in a row to freeze spirits duties, and I will do so for the remainder of this Parliament, and this will be the longest freeze on duty in nearly half a century. My decision on cigarettes is for public health reasons to go ahead with a rise, but only the annual inflation rise of 8 pence a packet. At a cost of £165 million by 2008, I will replace the 8 existing tax schemes for pensions with a single lifetime allowance. I will set the allowance at £1.5 million for the first year of the scheme from April 2006, and will set the allowance now for the years until 2010, when the figure will be £1.8 million. Gift aid is now worth £2.3 billion a year to charities and voluntary organisations who are at the heart of British civic life. I propose a cash incentive to encourage small and medium-sized firms to set up their own payroll giving schemes. And with 2005, the British Year of the Volunteer, the Home Secretary and I will consider in the spending review new resources for 2 volunteering initiatives, first to encourage and extend mentoring in the United Kingdom, and second to encourage national community service by young people. Churches and sacred places of worship are not just an essential part of our religious life, they're an important part of the history and the fabric of our country. Before 2000, churches paid 17.5% VAT on all church repairs. Since 2000, grants we introduced have covered 12.5% of the VAT bill. I can now announce that until March 2006, churches and sacred places will be able to reclaim not 12.5%, but all 17.5% of VAT. This will wipe out their liability in full. 2005 is the year also where, as the Prime Minister said, the needs of Africa will be the focus of the UK's G7 presidency as a presidency for development. And I can tell the House that in this spending review, this government will not freeze or cut international development aid, but we will increase it. Today I can announce matching funding for a year for the Commonwealth Education Fund, which supports the objective that by 2015 every child everywhere has primary education. And there will be matching funding also for the Sports Relief Charity, which will work with Comic Relief in tackling AIDS and poverty in Africa. Now, having made these decisions, Mr Deputy Speaker, on tax and tax reliefs, the normal budget tables published in the Red Book confirm for the 3-year period ahead that these budget measures are fiscally neutral and the fiscal stance is unchanged from the pre-budget report. In making my budget judgment, I had a clear choice. Falling unemployment and low debt interests have themselves yielded an extra £10 billion this year over 1997. Stability and sustained growth are yielding additional revenues. The choice in this budget was whether to cut tax rates or to continue our programme of rising public investment in order to meet the priorities of delivering stability, of security and economic strength. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know the scale of the threats we as a nation face to our security at home and abroad, and the obligations we owe and the investment we need to support our police, security services and armed forces. And while our schools have 20,000 more teachers and 80,000 more classroom assistants, and our hospitals 50,000 more nurses and 15,000 more doctors, this government holds firm to the belief that sustained investment is necessary to sustain world-class public services. We know also the scale of the economic challenge we face as a nation from global competition, And I have no doubt that the nations that will succeed long-term will be the nations that make the long-term choice to invest in the drivers of future prosperity: education, science and enterprise. And I hope that all members of the House would agree that if the long-term case for investment in the pursuit of excellence in education, science and enterprise is made, it is our duty in the interests of the whole nation to put short-term considerations second to ensuring that Britain is fully equipped for the future to compete. And because it is also our duty, when we consider public investment, to do everything to secure value for money, last year the Prime Minister and I decided to review the future of the Inland Revenue and Customs, and for rural services the Secretary of State for Environment set up the Haskins Review. And to prepare for our decisions of the 2004 spending review, in the budget of 2003, here in this House a year ago, we set up the Efficiency Review. We asked Sir Peter Gershon to work with us to identify how new technology, changing work practices and better procurement could free up resources in departmental budgets that we could allocate in the years ahead to frontline services. Alongside workforce reforms, in which the cooperation of public servants has been much appreciated, we are investing over £6 billion in modern technology, creating the potential for greater economies in back office and transactional services. And I will report in the spending review on individual departmental plans. But I can announce 3 decisions today. The Department of Work and Pensions, building on the merger of benefit offices and job centres and the investment of £2 billion in new technology, is able to unlock savings in back office administration and at the same time move resources to the front line so that we can expand our successful service of personal advisors. While improving these frontline services, the Secretary of State for Work and I have agreed by 2008 a reduction in the DWP budget of in excess of 5% in real terms. And the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is announcing today for his department a gross reduction of 40,000 staff posts, a redeployment of 10,000 posts to new priorities, and thus an overall reduction over 4 years of 30,000 posts. Staff numbers will fall from 130,000 now to, by 2008, 100,000. We are also announcing that as a result of the O'Donnell Review, we will merge Her Majesty's Customs and Excise and the Inland Revenue. Whereas in the past business had to deal both with the revenue and customs, business will now deal with a single tax service, which, because of the investments we have made in the new technology, can make large savings in back office costs. And while improving front office services, I've decided in the spending review on a budget reduction by 2008 in excess of 5% in real terms. The Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise are announcing today a gross reduction of 14,000 staff posts, a redeployment of 3,500, and thus an overall reduction by 2008 of 10,500 staff posts. In these 2 departments, covering 40% of the civil service, there will be a gross reduction by 2008 of 54,000 posts, and after redeployment, an overall reduction of 40,500 staff. And the Government has also decided that in the spending review, all departments will cut their administration budgets by at least 5% in real terms by 2008. And as part of his efficiency programme, the Secretary for Education is today announcing a 31% reduction in headquarters staff by 2008, which will enable him to direct more funds straight to schools and spend more cash per pupil in the classroom. By cutting in real terms the administrative budgets of departments, by reforming procurement both nationally and locally, by unlocking productivity gains from technology and workforce improvements, departments are to achieve in the spending review period annual efficiency savings of 2.5% a year, boosting effective frontline service delivery by £20 billion a year by 2008. Mr Deputy Speaker, planned administration costs, which were an average of 5% of total spending in the 1980s and rose to 5.7% in the early 1990s, will fall to 4% and then to 3.7% by 2008, and that is the lowest level since the running cost regime was first introduced. Now, having made these reforms, I can now set the guidelines for overall spending and investment to 2008. I've already allocated money for 2005-06, and I propose to confirm that allocation. I've also allocated funds to the National Health Service through to 2008. The Secretary for Health is reporting today that since 1997 there's been a 20% rise in elective admissions, a 66% rise in MRI scans, a 50% rise in CT scans, a 50% rise in the number of heart operations. 99% of cancer patients are now seen within 2 weeks of urgent referral. And of the 114 of the 114 new hospital developments commissioned since 1997, over 40 have already opened. And to support the Health Secretary's plans for greater flexibility, diversity and local accountability, I can now confirm that, as previously announced, the NHS will receive each year to 2008 a 10% cash rise, a 7.2% rise each year in real terms. And having made these allocations, I am still able to release substantial resources while meeting all our fiscal rules. Current spending will rise from 2006 to 2008 by 2.5%, in line with our cautious view of the trend growth of the economy. Investment will rise to 2.25% of GDP as we make up the backlog of investment while meeting our fiscal rules. And let me therefore set out the figures. Total managed expenditure will rise from 459 billion this year, 488 billion next year, to 522 billion in 2005-6, 549 billion in 2006-7, rising to 579 billion in 2007-8. And this means that we have in 2006-7, for departmental and annually managed expenditure, after all our health allocations, additional resources available of £20 billion, rising by 2007-8 to an extra £40 billion a year as a result of the gains we have made from growth, falling unemployment and low debt interest. And in this budget, and later in the spending review, I will allocate these resources. When the allocation of additional resources was made 10 years ago, 75% of these additional resources had to go to pay debt interest and the rising costs of unemployment. Only 25% to priority services. But debt interest payments are now and will remain around 2% of national income, less than at any time since 1915, and unemployment costs are falling. So let me summarise. I have shown how the British model for monetary and fiscal policy is locking in stability for the future, with lower debt and lower deficits than our competitors. I've shown the dividend from stability and growth that allows rising investment to meet our priorities of delivering stability, security and economic strength. And I've shown how the investments we make are not only affordable, but fully financed and linked to reform. I will set the total amount of departmental spending and allocations at the time of the spending review, when I will also publish our forecast for annually managed expenditure, including debt interest and social security costs. The growth rate of both overall spending and departmental spending will be lower in this spending review than in the last, but with administrative costs cut and with wider efficiency improvements, we will be able to deliver substantial further increases in resources direct to the front line, to patients, to pupils and to users. And as I consider what these allocations should be, I have, of course, had a number of representations about the path and priorities for public spending in the years ahead. Full announcements will be made in the spending review in July, but I can confirm the following decisions. It has been put to me that we freeze the defence budget and cut it in real terms. At a time when our armed forces are now serving in Iraq, Afghanistan and Kosovo, as well as in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, and I applaud their dedication to the work of this country, such a course would be irresponsible, contrary to the national interest, and I reject it. In the last spending review, we allocated the largest spending increase in 20 years to defence, and I can tell the House that I propose real terms increases in defence spending in the coming round. There have also been representations, Mr Deputy Speaker, to freeze the Home Office budget and cut it in real terms. And I have agreed with the Home Secretary that, having increased the numbers of police, this would be exactly the wrong time and contrary to the national interest to freeze expenditure on the Home Office. I've also received representations we should freeze the transport budget, cutting it in real terms. And I have consulted with the CBI and business organisations, and they feel it is critical to the economy to press ahead with investments in our infrastructure. And we should not return to the old stop-go in spending, which left under the last government hundreds of road projects planned but never completed. So the spending review will provide So the spending review will provide not for cuts, but for real terms growth in transport in our country. And I have also rejected representations to freeze spending on housing, on local government, and on services to children and the elderly. I have received proposals to cut the science budget and the skills budget and to abolish the New Deal. But instead of cutting these budgets, I believe it essential that as skills, knowledge and technology become more central to our future prosperity, now is exactly the right time to invest in British science and British education. And this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is our budget choice. Because we cannot be a strong economy if we are weak in education and science. We will first of all work with the scientific community and our science-based companies so that in this spending period we can raise the level of science funding as a share of national income with one purpose: to make Britain the best and most attractive location for science and innovation in the world. And today the government is also announcing a 10-year framework for medical science. Our health budget is not just what we spend on the National Health Service, but on medical research that is bringing new treatments and cures. Modelled on the successful National Cancer Research Institute, the 10-year plan of the Secretary of State for Health will fund specialist research institutes for other diseases, a new British national clinical research network that brings public and private sectors and medical charities together. And I can confirm today that the combined budget for medical research and development within the NHS will not be cut, but it will rise, and by 2008 it will approach 1.2 billion for research each year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, from 1997 the New Deal has helped 1 million men and women from unemployment to employment. And as we upskill our economy, the next challenge of the New Deal, the challenge for every advanced industrial nation, is to equip people to move from low-skilled work into higher-skilled work. So we will now constitute a New Deal for skills that will offer in job centres for the unemployed and the employed a one-stop service advising on skills with access to personal skills advisors and training. And in line with our policy of matching rights with responsibilities, not only will job seekers be required to undergo a check about skills, but new incentives will be piloted to encourage lone parents, incapacity benefit claimants, partners of the unemployed also to gain new skills. The New Deal for skills will mean a guarantee of opportunity for every adult to gain level 2 skills. Building on the successful first phase of employer training pilots, I can announce also their extension, working with employers to the North East Lancashire, the Black Country, Devon, Cornwall, Cambridgeshire and West Yorkshire. The new guarantee to adults will be matched by a guarantee to the young, and with new junior apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeship courses, allied to improvements that I'm announcing today in benefit rules for young people, every teenager will have the offer of training or education until age 18. Mr. Deputy Speaker, having in the last spending round tackled underinvestment in schools and in teaching staff, the primary focus of this spending round must be on excellence and improving standards for all by supporting strong leadership in our schools, diversity of provision throughout education. And the aim is that we use the modern technology and teaching to offer our pupils tuition and learning that is tailored to their needs, and so move Britain to the top of the World League for standards and results in education. So, matching our new investment to reform, the Secretary of State for Education is announcing today the next stage of his modernisation of primary and secondary education. Building on previous reforms to raise standards, the literacy and numeracy hours, excellence in city, the New Deal for schools, reforms in the teaching profession, he's designating up to 1,000 more specialist schools alongside more city academies, offering greater autonomy and flexibility for schools that are succeeding, providing more discretion for head teachers over school budgets, training more teachers and assistants for coaching and learning matched to individual pupil needs with wider options for the curriculum, encouraging new partnerships between schools and within communities, extending school hours with additional classes and services, and thus empowering our nation's schools to raise standards for all pupils. And to advance these modernisation plans, the overall capital investment budget for English in education, which was just £1 billion a year in 1997, will be £6 billion next year, and it will rise to £8.1 billion a year by 2008. Similar announcements will be made for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and our capital investment allocations will ensure for every constituency in the country that by 2015 every secondary school can be refurbished or rebuilt with world-class technology in every school and the best state-of-the-art learning support in every classroom. And in line with our commitment to get resources to the front line, the settlement for education that the Secretary of State is announcing today will ensure more money goes direct to the school and the head teacher to spend on his school's priorities. And for the year 2005-06, we can announce that there will be a payment in the typical primary school direct to the head teacher of over £55,000, and in the typical secondary school direct to the head teacher of £180,000. It has been put to us that our guarantee of increased educational investment should be limited only to schools, and that in the years to 2008 we should freeze cash spending and cut it in real terms for universities, further education, colleges, apprenticeships, adult skills, lifelong learning, as well as nursery education to be cut, daycare and childcare for the under-5s. But this cannot be the right decision when we know that chances in life are determined as much before the age of 5 as after, and when we know also that 8 million adults do not yet have the basic skills for modern economies. Sure Start is tackling child poverty. Early years education and childcare is vital to parents and to child development. So the Secretary for Education is announcing today that funds for Sure Start, early education and childcare will not be cut, but they will rise from 2004-05 to 2007-08 by £669 million, an average annual real terms rise of 17%. And the Secretary for Education is also announcing that by 2008 there will be a total of 1,700 children's centres, one in each of the country's 20% most disadvantaged wards, as we advance towards our goal of a children's centre for every community. And the Secretary of State is also announcing our university and student finance reforms will be matched by rising real terms funding to progress towards the 50% target for students in higher education that would give thousands more students with qualification the opportunities they deserve. The settlement will maintain the level of real term student funding per head and ensure that universities receive in full the benefit of additional revenue from the government's higher education reforms. So to fund our further school reforms, a rising number of teaching assistants and teachers, I can announce for England the educational and settlement in full for the 3 years to 2008 that, compared to growth of 1.4% a year in the 18 years to 1997, there will be a real terms rise averaging after inflation 4.4% a year. In 1997, when we came to government, England spent just £2,500 per pupil per year. Today it is already £4,500. By 2007-08, it will be £5,500, twice the 1997 figure, and £1,000 more per pupil between now and 2007-08. So the education budget for England, which was £29 billion in 1996-07, will rise from £49 billion this year, £52 billion next year, to £60 billion in 2006-07, and £64 billion by 2007-08. And the education budget for the United Kingdom, which was £37 billion in 1996-07, will rise from £59 billion this year and £63 billion next year to £72 billion in 2006-07 and £77 billion by 2007-08. So with our announcements today for UK education, an additional £8.5 billion in 2007-08 compared to 2005-06. £8.5 billion extra that is not only affordable but fully funded and linked to standards and reform, the gains from stability and economic success, the dividend from the strength to take hard decisions about priorities every year from 1997, and at all times meeting our fiscal rules. UK education expenditure, which was just 4.7% of national income in 1997, will rise to 5.6% in 2007-08, from one of the lowest in the industrialised world in 1997 to amongst the best in 2007-08. And I have one final announcement. This summer, the review of local government finance will report. But I do understand the difficulties today faced by older pensioners on fixed incomes, especially the over 70s. The evidence shows that their council tax bill take a higher share of their income than the rest of the population. So for this year, for those over 70, on top of the winter fuel payment, we will pay an additional £100 to each household. Together with the winter fuel payment, pensioners aged over 70 will this year receive a total of £300, and pensioners aged over 80 a total of £400. I hope members on all sides of this House will welcome the extra support for pensioners. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our foundation, economic stability, our achievement, sustained growth, our choice, more investment, not less. Now and into the next Parliament, our prudence is for a purpose, and I commend this budget to the House.
Under Standing Order number 51, the first motion, entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes, must be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally? The question is that, pursuant to Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect shall be given to the following motions. A. Rates of tobacco products duty, motion number 2. B. Rate of duty on beer, motion number 3. C. Rates of duty on wine and made wine, motion number 4. D. Amusement machine licence duty rates, motion number 17. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I shall now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the motion entitled Amendment of the Law. And it is on that motion that the debate will take place today and on the succeeding days. The remaining motions will not be put until the end of the budget debate next week, and they will then be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor please move the Amendment of the Law motion? The question is, 1, that it is expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt and the public revenue, and to make further provision in connection with finance. 2, this resolution does not extend to the making of any amendment with respect to value-added tax, so as to provide A, for zero rating or exempting a supply, acquisition or importation, B, for refunding an amount of tax, C, for any relief other than a relief that 1, so far as it is applicable to goods, applies to goods of every description, and 2, so far as it is applicable to services, applies to services of every description. Mr. Michael Howard.
Sir Alan, may I congratulate the Chancellor on the delivery of his budget. He's chosen to deliver his budget on St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick famously described himself as the most humble-minded man. That is not an accolade for which the Chancellor is a contender. The Chancellor's budget begged the central question which goes to the heart of his performance. If everything's going so well, why does he have to borrow so much? The Chancellor made great play of the fact that the budget controls the growth of spending and borrowing. But let's look in some detail at what he means by that. 3 years ago, in his 2001 budget, the Chancellor forecast borrowing over 5 years at £30 billion. By 2002, just a year later, that forecast had risen to £72 billion. Today, he's predicting borrowing of over £140 billion. He's on course to borrow this year alone almost 5 times as much as he forecast at the time of the last election. And this is at a time when he claims the economy is doing well. How much would this Chancellor be borrowing if the economy went into a downturn? That's the answer to all his rigmarole about balanced budgets. The truth is that this is a credit card budget from a credit card Chancellor. The borrow now, tax later budget from the borrow now, tax later Chancellor. And if he has his way, the country will pay for it later in Labour's third-term tax rises. With this Chancellor, we know the importance of looking at the small print. Page 232 of the Red Book, just published, shows that the amount people save has fallen from 10% of their income in 1997 to just 5% this year. That from a party which promised a savings culture. As a senior manager at one of Britain's biggest investment companies said only 2 weeks ago, the government's policy on savings is a mess and it will take years to repair the damage. The Chancellor talked about enterprise, as he does every year. Page 225 of the Red Book shows that business investment has fallen for 2 years in a row. Page 237 of the Red Book shows that the trade deficit is at the highest level since the 17th century. And page 240 of the Red Book makes it clear that manufacturing output is lower than it was in 1997, in common with manufacturing investment. And the number of people employed in manufacturing is falling by 6,000 a month. All this from a Chancellor who promised an industrial policy so that our manufacturing industries can grow again. There are, of course, some things in the budget which we welcome. We welcome, as I'm sure the whole House does, the fact that the Chancellor is increasing the resources available to combat terrorism. We also welcome the potential savings that could arise from merging the Inland Revenue with Customs and Excise. But can the Chancellor guarantee that there will be no political interference in the enforcement of tax law? And after the debacle that followed the transfer of responsibility for tax credits to the Inland Revenue, can he assure us that disruption on a similar scale is not likely to happen again? The Chancellor has also published the Barker report into housing supply. We will scrutinise with care the implications of the proposals in this area. So far, all that this government has achieved is to hold the record for the lowest number of new houses built in peacetime since 1924. And we welcome the announcement that he's made about the increase in the amount he's going to give pensioners over 70. But those pensioners should be warned. What this Chancellor gives, this Chancellor takes away.
Every time.
And we particularly welcome the Chancellor's announcement that Britain won't be joining the euro. Though, to save the blushes of his right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he didn't put it quite like that. So much for his claim in June that there's been significant progress in achieving cyclical convergence. Last year he promised we're within the Maastricht criteria on deficits. Now we know he failed to keep that promise. He wasn't within the criteria then, and he certainly isn't now. He's broken the rules, and he hasn't even joined the club. It would be churlish not to congratulate the Chancellor for getting one growth forecast right. But his growth is fuelled by a public sector boom paid for by a public sector Chancellor. And of course, growth forecasts weren't the only forecasts that he made. Compared with last year's budget, his forecasts for revenue were wrong, his forecasts for the deficit were wrong, and his forecasts for borrowing were wrong. None of the Chancellor's bluster can disguise the fact that this is a government which has increased taxes and increased borrowing. And the borrowing he's announced today is simply unsustainable. This budget has made it clear that if Labour get a third term, tax rises are inevitable.
That's right.
The Prime Minister said in opposition they had no plans to increase tax at all. At the weekend, the former Paymaster General, the Honourable Member for Coventry North West, told us why. They did discuss tax rises privately 2 years before the election. But he said, it's very difficult to win an election if you go out saying, look, if you elect me, I promise you I'm going to absolutely smash you with taxes you've never heard of. So they said they'd no plans to increase tax at all, and ever since then they have indeed been smashing people with taxes they'd never heard of. There have been more than 60 tax rises, and we're paying half as much tax again as we were in 1997. Last year, the real value of people's take-home pay actually fell. And after another inflation-busting rise in council tax, average bills have now risen by 70% since 1997. Business is paying more tax too. The Chancellor has burdened it with £15 billion a year in extra taxes and red tape. As the Chief Executive of Tesco told the Chancellor at one of his intimate gatherings, like a tide, the level of taxes seems to be forever rising. The water is now above our waist. As David Frost, the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, says, British business can't compete with a £30 billion millstone around its neck. Yet despite all these taxes, the Chancellor still has to borrow more and more. This is the Chancellor who said in 1996, "We will not build the New Jerusalem on a mountain of debt." But today a mountain of debt is exactly what he is creating. And that's why independent commentators say third-term tax rises are inevitable under Labour. The Item Club, who use the Treasury's own model, say the public finances continue to deteriorate alarmingly. The OECD warn of a possible sizable structural deficit. The Financial Times says the Chancellor should be preparing options for a tax rise after the election. And after today's budget, that black hole is still there. That's what happens if you have a borrow now, tax later budget from a borrow now, tax later Chancellor. And it's not even as though the money that he's borrowed to spend has been spent wisely. After all the years when the government said it was spending our money really well, we now learn that its own adviser has revealed £15 billion a year of waste. This is the Chancellor who said there won't be a penny more spent on the health service until we get the changes that let us make reforms and carry out the modernisation the health service needs. This is the Chancellor who said that the extra money he's spending on public services is dependent on efficiency savings being released. He said that in his 1998 spending review, his 2000 spending review, and his 2002 spending review. And he's saying it again today. This is the Chancellor who said he was determined to get value for every penny we spend, to give people the public services they want. Every time he makes this promise, every time he breaks this promise. The annual cost of running central government is up by nearly £7 billion under his stewardship. 511 extra civil servants were hired every week last year. And now we discover, from the Gershon report, that they're secretly planning to hire over 300,000 extra public sector workers over the next 3 years. And that is after taking into account the reductions that he's announced today. And what has really been achieved? The number of children playing truant from our schools is up by 22%. Well, I would have thought honourable members opposite might just be worried about children playing truant from our schools. What hope is there for our future if our children don't even go to school under this government? Waiting times are getting longer and violent crime is at its highest level ever. A 37% increase in spending in the NHS has led just to a 5% rise in the number of hospital treatments. The OECD says in the health sector there are few indicators showing unambiguous improvements in outcomes over and above trend improvements that were already apparent before the surge in spending. And then in some areas, they go on to say, it's a body the Chancellor is very fond of quoting. He ought to listen to this. In some areas, they say, such as the numbers of patients treated and the average waiting times, performance has actually deteriorated. And as the Minister for Energy told a conference in America, in a speech mysteriously missing from the government website, too often a lot of money has been spent, but very little seems to have been achieved. In a year or so, he said, we're going to have an election in the UK when people will say we've paid a lot of taxes, but what has really been achieved with all that money? He was telling the truth. I'm afraid his prospects of survival in this government can't be high. A year before he became Chancellor, the Right Honourable Gentleman said, I want our Labour government to be remembered not as a big spender, but as a wise spender. But it wasn't long before the tax and spending habit kicked in. Very soon, the nation will face a choice. We on this side of the House want to give patients and parents and professionals more control, to bring in real reform. That's the way to end the cycle of tax and spend and fail. This government will never deliver real reform of our public services. All it offers is more of the same: higher spending, higher borrowing, and ever higher taxes. This budget will go down in history as the borrow now, tax later budget. This Chancellor will go down in history as the borrow now, tax later Chancellor. And this government will go into oblivion as the borrow now, tax later government. And the sooner they go, the better it will be for our country.
Dr. Vincent Cable.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to start by acknowledging, as I did last time when I spoke to the pre-budget report, the positive things about the economy and about the budget, because there are some. We have had greater economic stability than before 1997. The employment and unemployment position is enviable. Inflation is low. And the figure for the relationship between debt and GDP is fundamentally healthy. All of those things are positive. But the Chancellor's finest hour was in the first week in office in 1997, when he made the Bank of England independent. And many of the problems which we can now see have been building up ever since. And the big decision in this budget was not to tackle them till after the general election. And let me itemise what some of these problems are. First of all, we've got growing evidence of a very serious imbalance in the economy. It's an imbalance based on very high levels of consumer debt and inflated house prices, which has exposed very large numbers of families to financial disasters if interest rates rise and house prices fall. Now, when I first raised this with the Chancellor on the floor 6 months ago, he rather derided this as some personal eccentricity of mine, but I'll point out to him, because he may have been too busy this morning, the comment that was made by the Monetary Policy Committee only this morning about this problem, where it notes in its minutes, which are issued today, household financial positions could well become unsustainable and so increase the probability of an eventual abrupt adjustment process. And what that consists of is a remarkable boom in house prices, which even the IMF, not us, has estimated to have led to an overvaluation of 30 to 35%. Now, the Chancellor today did mention these very useful reports by Miles and Barker. I welcome the practical suggestions they've made. Indeed, I was rather amused that after decades of Liberal Democrats promoting the idea of site value taxation, it at last seems to have taken root on the Treasury benches. But the technical improvements which Barker and Miles will produce don't even begin to address the problem of the speculative bubble which lies behind the housing market and which could well collapse with disastrous consequences, and the £1 trillion of household debt that has been built on the back of that. And the other side of the imbalance is what's happening to the productive sector of the economy. The Chancellor talked about his projections for manufacturing investment. What he failed to mention was that over the last 3 years, manufacturing investment has fallen by a third. And his 200-year history of the British economy failed to point out that there has been a record £4.6 billion trade deficit in January, record of all time. Secondly, moving on specifically to the budget, I believe, and here I disagree with the Conservative leader, I don't believe there is a fiscal crisis. There is a fiscal deficit problem that needs addressing, and indeed the Chancellor slipped into his speech an acknowledgement that the fiscal deficit will be £6 billion higher than the estimated in the pre-budget report. We believe, and I think he's gone some way to acknowledging this, that therefore public spending needs, the growth of public spending needs to slow down until its growth is comparable to that of the British economy as a whole. We don't favour the kind of extreme measures that the Conservatives seem to have adopted. It was interested in the list of submissions which the Chancellor made, and I think he was talking about the Conservative submissions. He didn't specifically mention their proposal on local government finance, which, as I understand it, would raise council tax by 10%. I suspect one of the reasons he didn't mention it was that nowhere in his budget speech did he give his own estimate of what council tax rises are likely to be next year, an absolutely critical issue. Because that leads to the heart of our disagreement with the government over taxation policy, which is not about the aggregate level of taxation, it's about the fairness of taxation. And one of the key statistics, which I think the Chancellor, who has a legitimate record of concern over social justice, should be most ashamed of, is the fact that the bottom 20% of the population in terms of income pay a higher percentage of their income in tax than the top 20%. And the major reason for that is the system of council taxation, which the government inherited from the Conservatives, but have done nothing fundamentally to reform. But I do hope and I do sense that our argument for local income tax is beginning to win the day. And a government spokesman out the only other day said, and I quote, that local income tax is now recognised by the government as a realistic option, as a strong, sustainable source of funding for local services. And we believe, and will repeat, that ability to pay has to underpin all direct taxation. And it doesn't underpin local income tax. We know the Prime Minister is very hostile to this reform. The Chancellor has wisely kept mum about it. What he did do today was to introduce some welcome top-ups for older pensioners. That's an idea we have promoted consistently over the years, targeting help on older pensioners who need help most, but to apply it not in its own right, but as a sticking plaster for the injustice that's created by local income tax. The other element of disagreement in terms of tax policy, which the Chancellor didn't even touch on today, was our disagreement about marginal rates of tax, where we accept that very high earners over £100,000 should pay a marginal tax rate of 50%. What the government has never acknowledged in condemning this proposal is that its own proposals incorporate marginal tax rates of 50% or more for several key groups. As a result of the change in provision for students, those earning over £35,000, when they pay their graduate tax, will be paying a marginal rate of 50%. And the Chancellor today slipped in a quiet reference to the lifetime cap on pensions, and he mentioned that it had increased it a little bit. What he didn't acknowledge was that the marginal rate of tax on these pension pots, which applies to groups like airline pilots, for example, won't be at the horrendous rate of 50% that the Liberal Democrats have been identified with, but 55%. So much for the government's concern about high rates of taxes. Thirdly, on the issue of tax simplicity, when I first raised this issue, I quoted an analogy with the gentleman who's earned the nickname of Tinkerman, Mr. Ranieri at Chelsea, and since Chelsea are now progressing rapidly through the Champions League, maybe I should find a less successful analogy. but nonetheless, the point remains that the government, the Chancellor in particular, have introduced endless successions of gizmos and wheezes and gimmicks, of which we had more today, which have complicated the tax system without in any way improving on it. And one of the measures which he touched on very briefly was the failure of his attempt to introduce an incentive last year for incorporated businesses. What he has said in the Red Book, and I would be grateful at some point for clarification of this, is that the reform which he's now proposing is going to raise an extra £490 million.
1 year.
In 1 year, effectively penalises all those businesses which in perfectly good faith went to the expense and the trouble of shifting to incorporation. Let me finally switch to the issue of public spending. Now, the Liberal Democrat view over the years has been very clear and transparent. We argued for an increase in investment in public services. We argued that taxes needed to pay for that. We campaigned on that at the last general election. And the government has delivered that investment, and we voted for it, and we supported it. Unfortunately, they didn't do it in an open, honest way, and that, unfortunately, has contributed to much of the cynicism which now exists in the general public about the tax system. The government now faces some tough choices about public spending. The Chancellor has given some hints today about where he proposes to make some of his economies. Implementing the Gershon report, we fully support that, entirely sensible. But what is missing from all this, I think, is some indication of the tough choices that will have to be made. I mean, the government, no more the Conservatives, can get away with arguing that the only way to rein in public expenditure is to cut waste. I mean, there really do have to be tough choices. And we have argued, I have argued, that some departments, Department of Trade and Industry, DEFRA, are grossly overstaffed and, moreover, do far too many things that should be stopped. The government itself is introducing proposals which are wasteful and of low priority. The Chancellor, in his speech, referred to the need to maintain the Home Office budget, and we agree with that. What he didn't point out was that up to £3 billion is going to be taken out of the Home Office budget to spend on identity cards. His own departments are responsible for introducing the baby bond scheme, which is superficially attractive, but is an extremely inefficient, ill-thought-out way to use hundreds of millions of pounds that could be better used on early years education. He has introduced what sounded today like these very radical proposals for civil service relocation. The Lyons report, we're totally in favour of that. What he didn't point out was that less than 1 in 10 of civil servants located in London and the southeast of England will be affected by it. And let me quote the figures for his own department. The number of London staff will be reduced from 1,152 to 1,134. 18 officials, less than 1 in 100 will be moved. And that shows leading not by example. Finally, on public spending, I think I do have to point out that one of the reasons, an important reason, why public expenditure has grown faster than was expected was because of the Iraq War, which is approaching $3 billion and an extra $200 million a month. I don't want to rehearse all the political arguments, but that's not appropriate here. Safe to point out one crucial point, that this country has been to war before in the Middle East in the early 1990s as part of a genuine multilateral campaign. And as a consequence of that, the international community paid 80% of the costs. Because of the way this government approached that conflict, the British taxpayer is now having to pay every single penny. My final comment is on the euro, and the Chancellor raised his usual annual laugh by kicking this even further into the grass than usual. And I would simply point out, I think it's an obvious point, that this is probably the most important single economic issue confronting this country. And it is a decision that is sooner or later going to have to be made. And I think the Chancellor should be honest with us that by not making this decision, costs are being incurred. British manufacturing has, for the last 7 years, been trading at a competitive disadvantage of around 30% as a result of the appreciation of the real exchange rate. As a result of the collapse of Britain's share in foreign direct investment from 27% in 1998 to 7% in 2002, we see a very clear sign that international business is moving to the Eurozone. And if we'd held on to our 1998 share, we'd have seen an extra £80 billion being ploughed into productive investment in parts of Britain like the North West and Wales. And this is a real cost that has been paid as a result of fudging and repeatedly postponing this decision. So the key point, I think, is that this is a budget that simply avoids taking all the key decisions that are going to have to be made for the long-term future of the economy.